I want to discuss with you today whether or not U.S. President Donald Trump's recent speech in Davos at the World Economic Forum is kind of, a curtain raiser on his concept, or a concept that is taking place, of a kind of new world order. And I think it's a worthwhile then, where does the term New World Order come from? Where are we thinking of the reference? Back in 1991, George H.W. Bush presented a concept of what he thought his administration was going to accomplish and how the world was changing at that time. And the term New World Order was used in that speech. Let's just take a look. Let's go to the videotape. Let's see what George H.W. Bush actually said in terms of that issue. So there's several speeches in which this was discussed, but they were in September and in 1991. Basically. And so let's just see, he was talking about the concept of peace, and he talked a lot about it. So he talked about how communism had held the world captive for years and how things were changing. He spoke a lot about the importance of the economy, and he spoke a lot about international organizations and the UN Charter. So he said, for instance, the world has learned that free markets provide levels of prosperity, growth, and happiness that centrally planned economies do not. It's kind of obvious, I guess. But at the time, it was a big question is, what will happen with the world as the decline of the Soviet Union kind of imploded, and it was clear that the United States, was going to be the preeminent superpower. And George H.W. Bush, didn't say, well, I want America to run the world. He said he saw a lot of hope in the United Nations and the changes, let's say, in terms of democracy. So it's worth to see, what did he say about that? He talked a lot about democracy, and he talked about, minority rights and liberty. And he spoke about democracy flourishing, and that was one reason he had wanted to confront Saddam Hussein in the Gulf War. So let's recall, I think, the most famous part of that second speech he made about the New World Order. He spoke about a new world order that can emerge, a new era, freer from the threat of terror, stronger in the pursuit of justice, and more secure in the quest for peace. An era in which the nations of the world, East and West, North and South, can prosper and live in harmony. So this was a big speech, or several speeches that he made, and it was clearly a concept and a doctrine that saw a lot of hope in the international system and international law, basically, and a rules-based order in which he thought the United States played a very important role, but not the only role. And the U.S. would work through international institutions, and he saw that as very important in how the world would develop and how this new world order would take shape. Now, the question I think we might ask then is, when we look at the Trump doctrine, or the speeches in Davos in terms of this week, basically January 2026, is whether or not we're seeing a kind of new world order being unveiled. And I say that because if we look back at the era after George H.W. Bush, you had the Clinton administration, who basically seemed to kind of agree with the concepts of the New World Order, but it kind of added to them a corollary of humanitarian intervention. Remember, the United States went into Somalia and other places, especially in the Balkans, and tried to prevent, what they saw was that ethnic cleansing of things. So the U.S. was focused on a whole series of interventions. They talked about, America being a kind of global policeman, nation building. Well, by the time you got to the global war on terror under George W. Bush, I think a lot of the concepts of that had already kind of gone out the window. Most Americans did not think nation building and being a global policeman was going to be good for the United States. Well, the U.S. got involved in the global war on terror, and there were human rights abuses, in places like Guantanamo and the U.S. was using force abroad. And suddenly the world looked a lot darker than what George H.W. Bush had talked about. And I think from that, the war on terror that lasted from, say, 2001 to 2020 or so, the withdrawal from Afghanistan, a lot changed in terms of how America approached the world and how people talked about this new world order. So you see that after George W. Bush, the Obama administration is much more reticent about involvement abroad, and it is kind of apologizing for the U.S. role. If you recall the speech in Cairo or the attempt for the Iran deal and other things, there was a decision by the United States to kind of walk back from playing this heavy-handed role abroad. Then you get to the first Trump administration, which is a bit chaotic, but at their administration, you already start to see, a lot more talk of kind of isolationism and America first, and let's not deal with NATO. If NATO doesn't want to pay for itself, that's their problem. There's a lot of questioning about American alliances, and so then you get after that to the Biden administration, and you get this kind of strange era where Biden says America's back, but then he leaves Afghanistan in the chaos, and then America completely zombie slouches into the war, the Russian invasion of Ukraine. If you recall, the Biden administration was saying, well, don't invade Ukraine, don't invade Ukraine. There's going to be an invasion of Ukraine. Well, then it happens and nothing, and not much happened, right? I mean, so you see that, and then October 7th happens, and the Biden administration is just slouching from crisis to crisis. So it's not really true that America's back, quote unquote. In fact, America is kind of hapless in some ways in dealing with these crises, even though people like Biden, who I'm sure were inspired by JFK and all these things, but they were not able to channel any of the concepts of a JFK or an FDR, Woodrow Wilson, or a TR. So that's where the administration is contradictory. Then you get to Trump admin number 2. And suddenly you have a really different Trump doctrine admin than the first time he was in charge, because you come in with a new team and they seem to be less at odds with each other. None of them are being fired every day like in the first term. And the Trump administration has some sort of a doctrine. It brings peace in Gaza, and then the administration tries to bring peace in other places, fighting in India and Pakistan and Southeast Asia, I think the Congo. I mean, they claim that they've solved 7 or 8 conflicts. And then there's, of course, the raid to get Maduro, but there's also the Gaza plan, the Board of Peace, which is announced in Davos in January 2026, after the ceasefire in Gaza happened in October 2025. And you start to see a doctrine that's taking shape, and it has some elements from the first term. Then there's other kind of interesting corollaries to it, like there's something that's been talked about, the quote Dunroe doctrine, which is the kind of Trump's twist on the Monroe doctrine for the Western Hemisphere. There's the demand to get Greenland, which apparently is probably part of that. You've got the U.S. push for a deal in Ukraine, and you've still got the U.S. skepticism about European allies and NATO and things like that. So there's a lot of different aspects to it, and it might be worth it just to take a quick look, since we did read the George H.W. speech. What does Trump talk about in Davos? The White House has put up a bit of the speech, or the ceremony of January 22nd, 2026, what I'm characterizing as a curtain raiser on a kind of new world order. I would say, and you can read it just if you'd like to see, the White House says, today, in an historic ceremony in Davos, Switzerland, Trump formally ratified the Charter of the Board of Peace, establishing as an official international organization. And, we can see, go down and see the talk of Trump's vision of transforming Gaza. We can look at the different people that are involved. And Trump's talk about, together, we are in a position to have any credible chance to end decades of suffering, stop generations of hatred and bloodshed, and forge a beautiful, everlasting, glorious peace for that region being the Middle East. So in a way, you could say, well, the Trump's concepts kind of similar to George H.W. Bush. There's a lot of concepts that are similar, but I think the big difference, if you look at the Trump speeches in Davos, the big difference is, Trump is lecturing the world a bit, kind of telling them this is how we Americans, how our administration sees things. And it's definitely very different in that concept than the George H.W. Bush, which was talking about the inspirations of a new world order in which the international community would play a very important role. And so I think that's where it's worth just getting a sense that these are two very, very different concepts and outlooks. It's worth to recall. George H.W. Bush said towards the end of his speech that took place, I think, in September 23rd, 1991. So just as he said at the end, he was kind of wrapping it up. He said, "Finally, you may wonder about America's role in the new world that I have described. Let me assure you, the United States has no intention of striving for a Pax Americana, American peace, a Roman peace, as if America had to control it all, right? However, we will remain engaged. We will not retreat and pull back into isolationism. We will offer friendship and leadership. And in short, we seek a Pax Universalis, a universal peace, built upon shared responsibilities and aspirations." So you can see that he's channeling, that American concept. I think of Woodrow Wilson a bit. You're talking about a world safe for democracy, and I think remember the JFK concept of two worlds, right? JFK had this idea of a world half free, a world half free, half slave. And he has this line, I just want to find it. So remember, JFK said at his inauguration, "Let every nation know, whether it wishes us well or ill, that we shall pay any price, bear any burden, meet any hardship, support any friend, oppose any foe, to assure the survival and success of liberty." So I think when we compare, George H.W. Bush, channeling a bit of JFK there, and the Trump administration, I think, in a way bookending some of this. And that's not to say, that it's all bad. I mean, the Trump administration is giving a whole new concept, but it's definitely different, I think, than what the strain that you see that runs from Woodrow Wilson to George H.W. Bush, and those concepts, and it's definitely different. And you can see that those concepts are certainly very much against isolationism and the new, Make America Great Again, MEGA, and other concepts that we're seeing. The Trump administration is perhaps tapping into things from the 19th century more than the 20th century. And that's where the new world order is perhaps coming into focus.